After travelling through a warp storm, Tyranid High Fleet has come across a strange planet full of unique and interesting life forms. This planet is known to the Imperium of Man as Yoshi's Island. The Tyranids have invaded the planet and now ready to consume the biomass. See what weird creatures are formed. Hello and welcome to Drunk on Tea. Today I'm going to paint this Tyranid Genestealer model, inspired by Yoshi from the Mario series. So the first thing I've done is I've primed the model black. This will give us that grimdark look to the model. And first of all, I'm coming in with some War flesh. I'm going to paint all of the skin. So you don't need to be neat at this stage, because we'll be painting over all the other areas with different colours. But just make sure you coat all of the flesh with a couple of layers of War flesh. Make sure you work this into all of the recesses over a couple of layers to build up to a solid coat of War flesh all over the skin to our Genestealer. Now where I've primed this model black, it's going to have a much darker appearance. If you want a much brighter, more cartoony look to your Yoshi inspired Genestealer, if you prime the model white, you'll get a much brighter end result. But I'm going for that grimdark Warhammer 40,000 look, so I've primed the model black, so we get that darker, more gritty look to the model. So you can see I'm applying a few thin layers of the War flesh all over the skin, slowly building up to a solid base coat all over the skin. And after a couple of layers, I've built up to a solid base coat of War flesh. Now the next step is I'm going to come in with some warpstone glow. And for this, I'm going to dry brush this all over the skin. You can be quite heavy with this. You want to make sure you leave the War flesh showing in all of the deepest recesses. Make sure you give good coverage with the dry brush of the warpstone glow to all of the raised parts of the skin. This is going to brighten the skin up, and over our next few steps we're going to really add some layers to give it that dinosaur appearance that Yoshi has in the video games. You don't need to be neat at all at this stage. Get this over any other parts of the model, but make sure you dry brush all of those raised areas with some warpstone glow to brighten up that skin. With the dry brush of warpstone glow applied, you can see how it's brightened up the raised areas, but left the darker War flesh showing, especially in all of the recesses. So now I'm coming in with some biltan green, and I'm going to shade all over the skin to the model. So this shade's going to darken everything down, tie everything together, and really darken down the recesses and accentuate the shadows all over the skin to the Genestealer. So I'm just making sure I coat all of the skin with a shade of biltan green. And after the shade has dried, you can see how it's really added definition to all of that skin, sunk into the recesses and darkened down all of the shadows on the model. So now I'm coming in with warpstone glow again, and once again as a dry brush I'm going to apply this all over the flesh. You can be very heavy with this. You just want to make sure that you leave the biltan green in all of the recesses with a little bit of the darkened down War flesh as well. And where we already applied this, we have that transition from light to dark on the skin. This is really going to accentuate that, brighten up the skin and really add interest all over the flesh to our Tyranid. So make sure you apply a fairly heavy dry brush of warpstone glow again all over the Tyranid, picking out all of those raised and flat areas, but leaving the shading in all of the recesses. And after that dry brush has been applied, you can see how it's brightened up the skin again. We've really got some nice transitions from dark to light, so there's just one more colour to apply to the skin to really give it that Yoshi look. And that's going to be with some moot green, which is a very bright green. But I'm going to lightly dry brush this all over the model, so it's going to pick out all of those raised areas and sit on some of the flatter ones, but I'm making sure I don't come too heavy. I want that warpstone glow to still show through. Just want this to catch the most raised areas, highest details, and brighten those areas up to give us the impression of light catching on the most raised areas. You could do this by layering it on with a brush, but this method's much quicker, gives a much more natural look to the skin, rather than just edge highlighting all of the details. And after that moot green's been applied, you can see it's really brightened up that skin, giving it a dark, gritty version of Yoshi's skin. So now it's time to move on to some of the other details. For the first detail I'm painting is this white belly, so I'm doing this with Celestra Grey. I'm going to pick out this part here on his underside. I'm going to leave the sort of horn spike area green. I'm going to make sure I pick out all of his ribcage area with some Celestra Grey. Obviously going to take a couple of layers to build up to solid coverage. Being really neat around the areas that I don't want to be white, I want to stay green. Just picking out all of his underbelly with some Celestra Grey, so we can give him that white belly appearance that he has in the games. Whilst doing the same to the tail as well. So there's this line going down the middle, about the halfway point. Everything below that line I'm painting with some Celestra Grey, but leaving the green on the top. So obviously be nice and neat. Don't want to get this over the areas that we want to remain green. I'm just painting all of the underside with some Celestra Grey. And I'm also going to pick out all of his claws at this stage as well. Leaving the green to the tips of the fingers, and then I'm just painting all of the claws with a couple of layers of Celestra Grey. And with that Celestra Grey applied, you can see how we've picked out all of the claws and his underside. Just really getting that Yoshi look to the model now. So next step is I'm going to shade all of the areas we've just painted with Celestra Grey. For this I'll be using known oil. And I'm just going to apply a shade of known oil all over these areas. Obviously being really careful around the green. I don't want to accidentally shade any of that with the known oil. But I just want to make sure I catch the underside to his belly and his tail, as well as the claws with a shade of known oil. Once that known oil is dried, you can see how it's added definition to all of those areas we painted with Celestra Grey. So now it's time to start highlighting up the belly and the bottom of the tail. For this I'll be using Celestra Grey again first. So wherever the shade hasn't settled, so on all the raised areas and details like that, I'm just bringing it back up to its brighter colour with a layer of Celestra Grey. So I'll make sure I leave the known oil sitting in all of the recesses, but I'm bringing all the larger, flatter areas back up to their brighter colour with a layer of Celestra Grey. With the Celestra Grey applied, you can see how it's brightened up those raised areas of his underside. So now it's time to apply a highlight to those areas as well as the claws. For this highlight I'll be using White Scar to give us that pure white underbelly look. For this I'm just applying it as an edge highlight on all the sharpest points and most raised details of his underbelly. So wherever there's a sharp edge or a raised part to his underside, I'm just catching these with a thin edge highlight of white scar. Doing the same on the tail as well, focusing it onto those most raised areas and prominent details, and just catching these with a really thin edge highlight of white scar. And all the claws, I'm just catching the sharpest points running down the tops and the sides. So for these sharp ones, you can use the side of your brush here. I'm just applying an edge highlight of white scar running down the sharp points. For the smaller ones, I'm just catching the very tips with a small spot of white scar. And with the claws and the underside highlighted up, the model's really starting to get that Yoshi look now. So the next thing I'm going to paint is the Carapace, or for Yoshi it would be the shell. For this I'll be using Mephiston Red. I'm going to apply this all over the Carapace armour to the Tyranid. So obviously be really careful around the skin that we've already painted and highlighted, but make sure you catch all of the parts of the Carapace armour with a couple of layers of Mephiston Red. If you're going for a much more cartoony look, you can start off with something like Evil Sun Scarlet, but I think Mephiston Red gives a good mid-tone for that grimdark appearance, while still giving the impression of Yoshi from the Mario games. So as well as the Carapace armour going down the back, I'm also making sure I catch the ones here on his head as well. Obviously being really careful around the other details. And because this is one of the newer Genestealer sculpts, I'm also making sure I pick out the details on his spine as well. I'm just catching these parts with a bit of Mephiston Red as well, just to give that Carapace armour appearance, running all the way down his back. And with the Mephiston Red applied, so we've got a nice red shell coming together on Yoshi now. The next step is I'm going to paint his tongue. For this I'm using Evil Sun Scarlet. I'm doing this just so it's a slightly different colour than the Carapace armour. It's going to be slightly brighter, and just make sure I pick out all of his tongue with a couple of layers of Evil Sun Scarlet so we get a nice solid tongue coming out of his mouth. With the tongue picked out, there's just one final colour left to apply, and that's going to be some Rawk stone, which I'm going to paint on his teeth. So obviously just carefully pick out all of his teeth with a couple of layers of Rawk stone, being careful to avoid the skin and the tongue. So take your time and paint all of the teeth with a couple of layers of Rawk stone. With the teeth picked out, that's all of the base coats now applied to our Yoshi style Genestealer. So now it's time to shade all those areas we've just painted. For this I'll be using known oil again. And I'm just going to shade this all over the Carapace armour, the teeth and the tongue. Because you don't want this to pull too heavily into any of the recesses. If you do see it pooling at any stage, just wick it away with a dry brush. But make sure you catch all of the tongue and the teeth, as well as the Carapace armour, with a shade of known oil. Don't forget to do the spines going down his back as well. Make sure you catch these with some known oil.
If you're enjoying the video, please press like. If you want more videos, press the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. If you would like to support the channel and become a member, please press the join button down below.
And after that Nuln Oil has dried, you can see how it's added definition to that Carapace armour, as well as darkening down the teeth and the tongue. So now it's time to start painting the Carapace. First of all, I'm coming in with some Celestra Grey. For this, I'm just going to paint a white line, very bottom of each of the plates. It's because Yoshi has a white border going around his shell. So for this, at the very bottom of each of the plates, I'm just painting a thin line of Celestra Grey, which will give the impression of that border going around. But we don't need to paint it as a thick, solid border, because each of these are individual plates, so I'm just applying a thin line at the very bottom of each one. Once that white line has been applied, you can see how it's broken up that red. Gives the impression of a white line going all the way around. Now with some white scar, the very edges of that white line, I'm just applying a very thin edge highlight of white scar. Let's keep this line nice and thin. Let some of the Celestra Grey show through on the side, but just catch the very edge of each of the armour plates with a really thin edge highlight of white scar. We're tracing around the very bottom of each of the Carapace plates with a little bit of white scar. Once that's been applied, that is the border to all of the Carapace highlighted. So now it's time to highlight the rest of the Carapace. For this, I'll be using Evil Sun Scarlet first. I'm coming in and applying this as a chunky edge highlight, going around the very edges of each of the plates and on any of the most raised details on the Carapace armour. So keep these lines nice and neat and just apply this chunky edge highlight going all the way around all of the Carapace plates, making sure not to paint over the white line we've painted at the very bottom of each of the plates, just highlighting all the rest of the race details with a bit of Evil Sun Scarlet. Doing the same to the ones on the head as well, just catching the very edges with a little bit of Evil Sun Scarlet. Obviously keeping these nice and thin, but large enough that I can come back in and apply another highlight within these in the next step. And I'm also making sure I pick out the very tops of all of the spines going down his back as well. I'm just catching the very edge of these with a little bit of Evil Sun Scarlet. See how it's brightened up the edges, giving the impression of light catching on the most raised areas of his Carapace. So now I'm coming in with some Wild Rider Red, and I'm going to apply a thin edge highlight within the Evil Sun Scarlet we just applied. So I'm catching the very edges of all of the plates with a really thin edge highlight of Wild Rider Red, making sure I leave a bit of Evil Sun Scarlet showing through as well. So just take your time at this stage, keep these lines nice and thin, just catch the very edges and tops of the most raised details with a very thin edge highlight of Wild Rider Red, but making sure that you leave a little bit of Evil Sun Scarlet showing through. This gives a really nice transition from the darkest colours to the brightest highlights. Don't forget the plates on the top of his head as well, making sure I catch the very edges of these with a really thin edge highlight of Wild Rider Red as well. I'm going to catch the very tops of all of the spines as well, so I'm just catching these with a really thin edge highlight of Wild Rider Red, making sure I leave a little bit of Evil Sun Scarlet showing through. With that Wild Rider Red applied, that is the Carapace highlighted. You can see it's really added detail, giving the impression of a bright red shell. So next I'm going to highlight the teeth. For this I'm using Ushabti Bone, I'm just going to very carefully pick out each of the teeth with a thin edge highlight of Ushabti bone. So obviously keep these lines really small. Just pick out the sharpest points of the teeth with a thin edge highlight of Ushabti bone. With the teeth picked out, there's only a couple of details left to paint on this Genestealer now. The next of which is going to be to highlight the tongue. So for this I'll be using Wild Rider Red again. I'm just going to pick out all of the raised parts to the tongue with an edge highlight of Wild Rider Red. These ridges going all the way down it. So I'm just making sure I pick out each one of these with a really thin line of Wild Rider Red. And with the tongue highlighted, the only thing left to paint on our Yoshi inspired Genestealer now is going to be the eyes. For this I'll be using Temple Guard Blue first, because Yoshi has really bright blue eyes, so these will really pop out from the darker colours all around. So I'm just sinking a little bit of Temple Guard Blue into those eye sockets. I've been really careful around the skin, just making sure I paint all of the eyes with a bit of Temple Guard Blue. And then finally, with some Abaddon Black, I'm just going to paint a small vertical line in the middle of the Temple Guard Blue. So this will give that alien-like pupil going from the top to the bottom. And really make those eyes stand out and be a focal point to the model, but still give us those bright blue eyes of Yoshi. And with the eyes painted, that is how to paint the grimdark 40k Genestealer as inspired by Yoshi from Super Mario. So please let me know in the comments down below, are there any other video game characters you would like to see me attempt to paint in a 40k grimdark style? But thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, an extra special thank you to Jenkins, our Tea Lover channel member. Thank you so much for the support, and happy painting!